The walls in Echelon 9 were built to erase sound, so the fact that he could still hear her, that wasn't an accident. It was a structural failure of the most intimate kind, a leak in the high-priced vacuum that So Jun-Ver had paid millions to inhabit. He stood on his balcony, the night air of the city pressing against his skin like a damp shroud, though the humidity didn't dare touch the steady, ice-cold grip he held on his glass. Beneath his feet, the building hummed with the hidden lives of the elite, the quiet whir of climate control, the ghost-like transit of elevators, the muffled wealth of 1,000 secrets. But through the reinforced concrete and the acoustic dampening, a different frequency emerged. It was a dull, rhythmic vibration, more of a pressure than a noise, a thud that resonated in the marrow of his bones. A sharp, cut-off gasp that carried the weight of a body hitting a surface it wasn't meant to touch. Jun-Ver didn't flinch. He watched the reflection of the adjacent unit in the floor-to-ceiling glass, his eyes tracking the frantic, flickering shadows of a struggle he wasn't supposed to witness. The woman next door, Yvonne Nix, was a silhouette of forced composure during the daylight hours, but at 10:47 p.m., she became a percussive element in his nightly solitude. He knew the man responsible, a loud, clumsy animal who mistook physical dominance for actual power. In Jun-Ver's world, power was silent. Power didn't need to break things to prove it existed. He traced the dark ink of a dragon's tail that curled around his bicep, the skin beneath it static and calm. He wasn't a man moved by morality, nor was he a spectator of common tragedies. But the repetition had become an insult. The noise was a persistent stain on his environment, a chaotic variable in a life he had spent decades streamlining into absolute order. He set his glass down on the stone ledge with a deliberate, chilling click. The vibration from the other side of the wall reached its peak, a heavy, final impact, followed by a silence so thick it felt like an intake of breath. Jun-Ver didn't check his watch. He didn't need to. He knew the pattern was reaching its inevitable conclusion. In the syndicate, men like Julian didn't get warnings. They were simply deleted when they became too loud to ignore. As he turned back toward the interior of his darkened apartment, the dragon on his back seemed to shift in the low light, a predator finally acknowledging a scent. The habit was a clockwork of brutality. So Jun-Ver leaned against the cold railing of his terrace, the night air pressing against the dragon scales inked onto his chest. He didn't need a watch to know the time. The shift in the building's atmosphere was enough. A sudden, sharp tightening of the silence that signaled the man next door had returned. At exactly 10:47, the first impact shivered through the floorboards. It wasn't a crash of furniture or a cinematic explosion of rage. It was a dull, dense thud of weight hitting a wall that was supposed to be soundproof. Jun-Ver took a slow pull of his cigarette, the smoke curling around his jawline in the stagnant air. He focused on the reflection in the dark glass, a silver-edged ghost of the woman in the adjacent unit. Yvonne Nix was a shadow moving with the practiced, terrifying grace of someone who had learned to breathe without making a sound. He watched her through the transparency of the high-rise windows, seeing the way she straightened a decorative vase after the first strike, her movements mechanical and hollow. She was a masterpiece of endurance, a woman who treated her own pain as a chore to be managed before the sun came up. The man who lived with her was a frantic, messy creature, a loud stain on the pristine reputation of Echelon 9. June Vere despised mess. He lived by the cold logic of the syndicate, where every action had a calculated cost, and every silence was earned. To hear this domestic filth through his own walls was a personal insult, a breach of the sanctuary he had bought with blood. He didn't move as the second thud vibrated through his heels. He simply stood there, barefoot and lethal, tracing the ink that spiraled down his forearm. He wasn't looking for a reason to be a hero. He was simply cataloging a malfunction in his environment. Yvonne slumped for a fraction of a second, her forehead resting against the cool glass of her own window, her deep brown skin catching the distant, artificial glow of the city. For a heartbeat, their reflections overlapped in the midnight sky. She didn't know he was there, a silent observer of her private wreckage. June Vere flicked the ash into the void, his eyes narrowing into two slivers of black flint. The husband was a man who played at power by breaking things that couldn't fight back. June Vere, however, was the kind of man who waited until the very last second to ensure that when he finally moved, there was nothing left to bury. The nightly ritual was no longer just a noise. It was a countdown. The elevator car was a box of brushed steel and artificial light, rising toward the upper floors with a hum so faint it felt like a vibration in the inner ear. Yvonne stood in the corner, her back pressed against the mirrored panel, her gaze fixed on the digital floor indicator. She wore a high-collared knit dress the color of sand, a garment designed to hide rather than highlight. Every breath she took was shallow, a careful preservation of the stillness she had cultivated since the sun rose. She thought she was alone until the doors slid open on the lobby level. So June Vere stepped in. He didn't rush. His movement was a fluid, predatory glide that occupied the space before he even fully entered it. He wore a charcoal suit jacket draped over his shoulders, his white shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the jagged edge of a black ink tail near his collarbone. The air in the small enclosure shifted instantly, replaced by a cold, metallic sharpness that had nothing to do with the building's ventilation. He didn't look at her, not at first. He simply stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the closed doors. Yvonne felt the sudden, frantic gallop of her pulse. She adjusted the strap of her leather tote, a reflexive shield. To anyone else, she looked like a woman returning from a quiet lunch. But as the car began its ascent, June Vere turned his head. His eyes weren't searching. They were dissecting. He wasn't looking at her face as a whole. He was focused on a single point, just beneath the curve of her jaw. There, the heavy layer of silicone-based camouflage had begun to flake. A tiny, jagged patch of yellow and deep violet peeked through the expensive matte finish, a fracture in her carefully constructed armor. Yvonne saw his pupils contract, a silent registration of the truth she spent her life burying. The silence in the elevator became heavy, thick with the weight of things unsaid and secrets exposed. He stepped a fraction closer. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him felt like a brand. He smelled of nothing but cold air and the faint, bitter tang of espresso. His gaze moved from the bruise to her eyes, locking onto her with a terrifying level of recognition. He didn't offer a polite smile or a neighborly nod. Instead, his mouth set into a thin, grim line of disapproval. Not for her, but for the clumsiness of the man who had left the mark. The bell chimed for her floor. As the doors retracted, June Vere finally spoke, his voice a low, abrasive friction against the silence. He told her to fix her mask. He didn't say it with kindness. He said it like a man pointing out a lethal flaw in a security system. Yvonne hurried out, the sound of her heels echoing like gunfire in the hallway, while behind her, the steel doors hissed shut on the man who now knew exactly what 1047 sounded like. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Echelon 9, a cold, clinical brightness that offered no warmth. Yvonne stood in the center of her kitchen, her fingers tracing the delicate, hand-painted rim of a celadon bowl, the last piece of her mother's collection that hadn't been shattered in a fit of manufactured rage. It was her anchor, a fragile weight of memory in a house built on fear. The front door didn't open. It exploded inward, the handle denting the drywall with a sickening crunch. Julian's presence was a jagged tear in the quiet, his breath smelling of expensive gin and a sour, simmering failure. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The tension in his shoulders was a broadcast of the violence to come. When his eyes landed on the bowl, his mouth twisted into a jagged sneer. He moved with a clumsy, heavy-footed aggression, snatching the porcelain from her grip. Yvonne didn't scream. She had learned that noise only fed the fire. But her hands flew to her mouth, a silent plea hanging in the stagnant air. With a casual flick of his wrist, Julian sent the bowl spinning across the room. It struck the marble kitchen island and disintegrated into 1,000 pale green shards that skittered across the floor like teeth. On the other side of the reinforced wall, June Vere was seated at his desk, a fountain pen poised over a ledger of offshore accounts. The sound of the impact reached him not as a noise, but as a physical intrusion into his focus. It was a sharp, discordant note in the symphony of his controlled environment. He didn't flinch. He simply stopped writing, the nib of the pen leaving a single, dark blot of ink on the paper. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, the silk of his shirt whispering against his skin. He walked to the common wall, placing a flat palm against the cool, sound-dampened surface. Through the masonry, he felt the vibration of Julian's voice, a low, distorted rumble of entitlement, and the frantic, shuffling retreat of Yvonne's footsteps. This wasn't the 1047 ritual. This was a daytime breach of the peace, a chaotic disruption of the order June Vere demanded. He looked down at his bare feet, the dragon ink on his ankles appearing to shift in the shifting light. To Julian, breaking a bowl was a display of dominance. To June Vere, it was a technical error in the building's operation. He reached for a black cashmere overcoat draped over a chair, sliding it on with a grim finality. He didn't need a weapon. His presence was the weapon. The noise had crossed a threshold from an annoyance to an unacceptable liability. As he stepped toward his own front door, his expression remained a mask of Arctic indifference. The time for observation had ended. The subterranean garage of Echelon 9 was a vault of polished obsidian and humming fluorescent tubes, where the scent of high-octane fuel and cold exhaust clung to the concrete. Julian stepped out of his sleek silver coupe, the door slamming with a metallic arrogance that echoed through the hollow space. He was fumbling with his keys, a jagged, impatient energy radiating from his frame, still riding the high of the afternoon's destruction. He didn't notice the shadow leaning against the structural pillar until he was nearly upon it. So Junver didn't move. He stood in the dim light, a dark silhouette against the white tiled wall, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He wasn't looking at his phone or checking his watch. He was simply existing in Julian's path, a physical blockade of sheer, unyielding intent. As Julian approached, the air seemed to lose its oxygen, replaced by a dense, pressurized stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Julian slowed, his bravado faltering against the sheer scale of the man in front of him. He tried to muster a look of annoyance, a "do you know who I am" sneer, but the expression died before it reached his lips. Junver's eyes were two chips of black flint, fixed on Julian's throat with a clinical, predatory focus. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't breathing in a way that suggested he was human. He looked like a statue carved from a nightmare, old and patient, and utterly without mercy. The silence between them was a physical weight, a crushing force that made Julian's knees feel weak. He tried to sidestep, but Junver shifted just an inch, a micro-movement that signaled a complete mastery of the terrain. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't utter a syllable. He simply stood there, the dragon ink on his neck visible beneath the collar of his coat, a silent testament to a world Julian couldn't even begin to comprehend. Julian's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the tomb-like quiet. He felt the sudden frantic urge to apologize for things he hadn't even admitted to doing. The power dynamic wasn't just shifted, it was obliterated. In the presence of a man who dealt in the finality of shadows, Julian's petty domestic cruelty felt like the flailing of a child. After a heartbeat that felt like an hour, Junver stepped aside. He didn't look back as Julian scrambled past him, his shoes scuffing the concrete in a desperate rush to reach the elevator. Junver remained in the dark, watching the red taillights of the silver coupe fade into the gloom. The warning hadn't been spoken, but the message was etched into the air. The walls were no longer thick enough to hide a man like Julian. The hallway of Echelon 9 was a corridor of muted gold and deep shadows, the air always tasting of filtered purity and expensive indifference. Yvonne stepped out to retrieve the morning delivery, her movements stiff, her ribs still aching from the previous night's lesson in obedience. She kept her chin tucked, a shield against the security cameras she knew were recording her every blink. But when she looked down, there was no package. Resting directly on the dark marble threshold was a small, weighted object wrapped in a scrap of black silk. It was positioned with surgical alignment to the doorframe, a deliberate placement that felt more like a message than a delivery. Yvonne's heart skipped a jagged beat as she knelt, her fingers trembling as she peeled back the fabric. Inside lay a heavy, matte black cylinder, no longer than her palm. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, no blade, no trigger. But as she lifted it, the sheer density of the metal told a different story. It was a tactical pressurized pen, crafted from a reinforced alloy that felt unnervingly cold against her skin. There were no markings, no brand names, and no note. Just the weight of it, solid and uncompromising. A tool designed to shatter glass or strike pressure points with a single, devastating thrust. She looked toward the door of the neighboring unit. It remained closed, a slab of dark wood that revealed nothing. There was no sound of movement from within, no shadow crossing the threshold. Yet the air in the hallway felt charged with a lingering metallic presence. It wasn't a gift of comfort. It was an invitation to violence. It was a silent acknowledgement that someone had heard the porcelain break and the muffled cries that followed. Yvonne curled her fingers around the cool metal, the ridges of the grip digging into her palm. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her marriage felt contested. The item was a signal, a declaration that her privacy was an illusion and her suffering had an audience. She didn't know if she was being protected or merely monitored by a superior force. But as she tucked the black silk and its heavy contents into the pocket of her robe, the fear in her chest shifted. It didn't disappear, but it sharpened, turning from a dull ache into a focused, lethal edge. She retreated into her apartment, the heavy door clicking shut with a finality that felt different this time. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was armed with a secret that the man sleeping in the next room couldn't possibly comprehend. The clock on the microwave glowed with a mocking, sterile green. 9:02 p.m. The numbers blurred as the front door slammed with a violence that shook the structural glass of the outer walls. Julian wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 hours. The schedule was the only thing that kept Yvonne's world from collapsing, the predictable rhythm of his absence allowing her to breathe, to heal, and to pretend. But tonight, the air in the foyer smelled of cheap gin and of frantic, localized rot. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't loosen his tie. He simply moved toward her, his footsteps heavy and uneven, a jagged disruption of the evening's artificial peace. Yvonne backed away, her hip catching the edge of the marble island where the celadon bowl used to sit. Her hand instinctively dove into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, ridged alloy of the gift she had found on her doorstep. It felt like a live wire against her palm, a heavy secret that pulsed with a dark, metallic intent. Julian's face was a distorted mask of grievance, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He didn't start with a word. He started with a shove that sent her reeling against the pantry door. The impact was sharp, a dissonant chord that rang through the apartment. This was wrong. The ritual was broken. The 1047 frequency had been bypassed for a raw, unfiltered cruelty that had no sense of timing. On the other side of the wall, the silence in Seo Junver's unit was absolute. He was standing in the center of his living room, his shirt discarded, the dragon ink on his back appearing to writhe in the low light. He didn't need to check a clock. He felt the shift in the building's vibration, a frantic, premature kinetic energy that signaled a total loss of control. The thud of Yvonne's body against the cabinetry reached him not through his ears, but through the soles of his feet. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in the lean contour of his face. He didn't reach for a phone or a weapon. He simply turned toward the door, his movements fluid and devoid of any human hesitation. To Junver, a broken pattern was a fatal error. The man next door had stopped being a nuisance and had become a chaotic variable that needed to be solved. Yvonne felt the sting of a palm across her cheek, the world tilting into a hazy, vibrating gray. She looked at the wall, her vision swimming, wondering if the man with the dragon tattoos was still listening. She wondered if he could feel the frantic, uneven tempo of her heart through the reinforced concrete. As Julian lunged again, his hands reaching for her throat, the air in the apartment seemed to drop 10 degrees. The countdown hadn't just accelerated, it had reached 0. The air in the living room was thick with the copper tang of Julian's erratic pulse and the sharp, chemical sting of his sweat. He had Yvonne pinned against the kitchen island, his fingers digging into the soft skin of her forearms with a desperate, clumsy strength. He was shouting something, a jagged, nonsensical stream of accusations, but the sound was suddenly drowned out by a noise that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't a crash or a bang, it was the precise, metallic sigh of a high-security lock being bypassed by a master key. The front door didn't swing open, it glided, admitting a sliver of the hallway's amber light. Junver stepped into the foyer. He was barefoot, his black trousers pooling slightly at his ankles, his chest bare save for the intricate dark ink of a dragon that seemed to coil around his ribs with every breath. He didn't look like a man who had just broken into a residence. He looked like a landlord arriving to inspect a faulty piece of machinery. Julian froze, his hand raised mid-strike, his shadow looming large and grotesque against the white cabinetry. He turned his head, his eyes widening as they struggled to process the intruder. "Who the hell?" Junver didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge Julian's existence at first. His gaze went straight to Yvonne, cataloging the red bloom on her cheek and the frantic, shallow rise of her chest. He moved forward with a silent, terrifying fluidity, his feet making no sound on the hardwood. There was no hesitation in his stride, no flicker of adrenaline or anger in his expression. He was a vacuum of emotion, a cold front moving through a humid room. As he reached the edge of the kitchen, Junver finally turned his eyes toward Julian. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He didn't raise his fists or take a defensive stance. He simply stood there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his presence so dense and absolute that it made the air feel thin. The dragon on his skin was a map of a world Julian could never survive, a jagged history of violence refined into a silent art form. Julian's hand remained suspended in the air, trembling now, the bravado of his intoxication evaporating under the weight of a superior predator. He tried to speak, but his throat had closed up, restricted by a primal fear he couldn't name. Junver took one more step, closing the distance until he was inches from the husband's face. He didn't touch him. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was a death sentence, written in a language of ice. The 9 p.m. interruption was over. The reckoning had arrived. The air in the kitchen reached a pressurized stillness, the kind that precedes a structural collapse. Julian's hand, still suspended in a pathetic arc of intended violence, began to shake with a frantic, involuntary tremor. He looked at the ink spiraling up Junver's neck, the dark, permanent sigils of a world that didn't negotiate. He tried to swallow, but his throat had turned to dry sand. Junver didn't throw a punch. He didn't roar. He moved with a clinical, submerged speed that made the overhead lights seem to flicker. One moment, Julian was a looming threat. The next, He was a heap of discarded meat. June Vere's hand shot out, not in a fist, but in a precise, vice-like grip that bypassed the jaw and locked onto the sensitive bundle of nerves at the base of Julian's skull. There was no struggle. Julian's knees buckled instantly, his nervous system short-circuiting under the expert application of pressure. He made a small, wet sound, a whimper of sudden, total helplessness, as he was pivoted toward the door. June Vere's expression remained as flat and undisturbed as a frozen lake. To him, this wasn't an altercation. It was a sanitization. He steered the stumbling, semi-conscious man toward the foyer with the same detached boredom one might use to move a piece of broken furniture. Yvonne stayed pinned against the marble, her fingers white-knuckled around the edge of the counter. She watched the dragon on June Vere's back shift as he worked, the creature appearing to breathe in sync with his steady, shallow inhalations. He reached the front door and shoved Julian into the hallway. The husband hit the far wall of the corridor with a soft, hollow thud, sliding down the gold-leafed wallpaper like a stain being wiped away. Two men in charcoal overcoats appeared from the shadows of the stairwell, silent, faceless extensions of June Vere's will. They didn't ask for instructions. They simply hoisted Julian by his armpits, his toes dragging across the carpet as they vanished toward the service elevator. There would be no police reports. There would be no noisy divorce. In Echelon 9, things that disrupted the peace simply ceased to exist. June Vere stood in the open doorway, his chest rising and falling in a slow, tectonic rhythm. He didn't turn around to check on Yvonne immediately. He waited until the sound of the elevator faded into the depths of the building, ensuring the silence was absolute once more. Only then did he pivot, his dark eyes scanning the room for any remaining traces of the mess. The 1047 frequency was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it felt like the beginning of the world. The silence that followed was not the fragile, hollow quiet Yvonne had spent years constructing. This was something denser, a heavy velvet that seemed to absorb the very air. She remained pressed against the cold marble of the kitchen island, her breath hitching in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, violent absence of a weight she had carried since her wedding day. The apartment felt cavernous, the shadows stretching toward the ceiling as if the walls themselves were exhaling. So June Vere did not move toward her. He stood by the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dim amber glow of the hallway. The dragon ink on his chest was still, the predatory tension in his shoulders finally beginning to settle into a calm, lethal grace. He looked at the shattered shards of the celadon bowl on the floor, then up at her. His eyes were no longer dissecting a malfunction. They were weighing a soul. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out 2 items, laying them side by side on the entry table with a metallic, definitive click. The first was a single silver key, unadorned and bright. The second was a heavy, obsidian-black signet ring, its surface etched with the same coded syndicate marks that spiraled down his forearms. His voice, when it finally broke the stillness, was a low, abrasive friction, devoid of pity, yet grounded in a terrifying kind of respect. He didn't offer an apology for the intrusion or a hollow promise of safety. He told her that the silver key led to a villa on the coast, a place where no one knew her name and the 1047 frequency was a forgotten nightmare. It was a clean slate, A life of soft edges and total, lonely autonomy. Then his gaze dropped to the signet ring. If she took the gold, she wouldn't just be leaving a ghost, she would be stepping into the center of a storm. She would be under his shadow, a permanent fixture in a world where the walls didn't just hide secrets, they protected them with blood. He wasn't asking her to be a victim or a guest. He was offering her a seat at a table where no one would ever dare to raise a hand in her direction again. Yvonne looked from the key to the ring, then back to the man who had erased her past in a matter of minutes. The tactical pen was still heavy in her pocket, a reminder of the sharp, cold edge she had discovered within herself. She didn't reach for the key. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her bare feet pressing against the cool hardwood, her eyes locking onto his with a newfound, jagged clarity. The silence in Echelon 9 was no longer a cage. It was a beginning.